Potter, who I believe is from UAA. Is that correct? Yeah, and is here to share with us a bit. His subject is good things, or his question is, do good things in life point to God? So I've been very interested in what he's got to say about that. But I'll also just remind everybody that if you haven't yet, go by the booth and look at the books that are on display out there. We do have somebody there who can help you purchase those items. And then after this session, again, there's coffee on for you, and we have a final and a last session here at 3. And in this chapel, in this room, it'll be Jason Ladd. He'll be talking about the role of Christian comedy as a tool for the gospel, especially in a secular environment. So I think that'll be really interesting as well. But then that's not the end of this event. We are hoping that everybody will go ahead and join us at Change Point tonight at 6 o'clock. That event will begin. And that is, again, open to the entire community. So anybody can come to that. There are a number of churches that are interested that will be meeting us there. But here's how that will go. At 6 o'clock, we're going to hear from Dr. Corey Miller, and he's going to be talking about truth, rhetoric, and the LGBTQ treatment. And so we got a little foretaste of that here in the last Q&A session, but he's going to really be diving into that issue, which we know is an issue that is very, very volatile. And he's going to be addressing things from a biblical standpoint, but he's also going to be opening the door to some of our questions. And so this will be kind of an interesting environment for us to be in, and for you to be in. But there will be open mic after Dr. Corey Miller presents. And there will be a panel discussion, just like we did moments ago here at Change Point, where people will be able to ask their questions, not just of the talk that he's going to be sharing on LGBTQ, but also just any question that people might have in the world of apologetics and defense for the faith. So hope you guys are looking forward to that. And again, it's not a ticketed event. So if you're wondering if somebody can, jump into your vehicle and go with you tonight to Change Point, they can. There's plenty of seats. They can just show up and they can get in on all of it. And we've strategically done that at 6 p.m. tonight, so families can be involved in that as well. And of course, we'll be live streaming for those of you who are watching us at this time. All right, without any further ado, I'd like to have you welcome to the stage for our session today, Dr. Potter. Would you please come?
It's really nice to be able to be here with you all. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to get to know some of you who are studying here at Alaska Bible College, and also to get to know some of the professors here as well. I teach at UAA in Anchorage, and I teach a lot of ethics classes. I teach classes in the history of philosophy, and upper division classes exploring questions like what exists, how can we know what exists, who are we, those sorts of things. So I'm really happy to be able to be here with you all. What I want to talk about is a question about the relationship between good things, value, we might say, and God. What's the relationship between goodness and God? Is my mic all right? I think it sounds all right. Okay. So the guiding question is, do good things in life point to God? So if we appreciated the goodness of something, would that start to lead us to ask questions about where this came from? What's the source of this value? And I want to approach this question in a very specific sort of way. What I want to suggest that we do is we look at a particular unique sort of experience that many of us have had, and we ask ourselves what best explains that experience. So I'm going to talk about this experience, this way that we relate to good things, a particular way, strange sort of way that we relate to good things. And then the question is going to be, what kind of understanding about the nature of value, accounts for this experience that we have. And in order to do that, I'm going to apply a methodology. So we have this experience we're trying to make sense of, and I'm going to propose a way that we go about trying to make sense of that experience. And then I'm going to talk about two kind of puzzles. It's often the case when we're trying to study something or understand something, there are different ways the world looks to us or appears, and they don't fit together. We have to make sense of them, and it creates these puzzles that we're trying to make sense of. So I'm going to talk about two puzzles, two things that, based on our experience about relating to the world, about relating to value, it generates these questions that we have. Then I'm going to talk about a couple different theories for making sense of these puzzles, right? So you can kind of think of the steps that we're going through like this. I'm walking through a room in the dark and I bump into this, right? It's in the dark. I don't know what it is. I have a problem, right? I have a puzzle. What's in my way? I could start to make theories about what it is, right? Is it a wall so I can't go around it? Or is it just a small object, right? So I'm going to talk about an experience. I'm going to talk about puzzles or obstacles that are created in our understanding about that experience. And then I'm going to talk about different theories that have been proposed for understanding how to sort out these problems. This is just kind of a step-by-step method that you'll find in the sciences, you'll find in theology. Whenever we're trying to understand something, we kind of go through these steps. We have these experiences, we get confused and puzzled by them, then we try to make sense of them and develop theories to make sense of them. So we're going to kind of go through those stages. And then I'm going to close by talking about a theory for making sense of these values, value perception, and theistic non-naturalism about value. So having sorted through a number of different theories, I'm going to kind of end on what I think is a promising theory for understanding what makes things good. And at that point, I won't give a lot of arguments for it. This is kind of a proposal, if you will. We're walking through these different options. We're talking about them a little bit, and then we're going to. I'll explain kind of where I'm inclined to think this makes how to make sense of these things, and that's where we'll get to. Where does God fit into this picture? Okay, so a little bit more about the methodology or the approach. I'm drawing from Aristotle here. So we've already just talked about this methodology that we're using, but it's drawn from Aristotle, who was a Greek philosopher in the 400s BC, and his philosophical work profoundly influenced the Western tradition. Christian thought in many ways drew from Aristotle. Aristotle was like the received sciences of the day in the Middle Ages. And this is what Aristotle proposes as a way for making sense of issues or questions that we have. He says, as in other cases, we must set out the appearances and run through the puzzles regarding them. In this way, we must prove the credible opinions about these sorts of experiences, ideally all the credible opinions. But if not, then most of them, those which are the most important. For if the objections are answered and the credible opinions remain, we shall have an adequate proof. Okay, what's he saying here? He's saying when we're trying to make sense of something, we start out with the way things appear to us, right? So it appears to me that I'm in a room with you all, right? And unless I have some more evidence that suggests otherwise, I'm just going to operate on that assumption, right? Unless half of my vision, something pops up and I begin to have reason to think I'm stuck in a simulation or something like that, I'm going to believe that I'm in this room with you all. So we start with the appearances, but sometimes those appearances, the way things appear to us initially, they don't match up. Sometimes they seem inconsistent with each other, and that's what generates a puzzle in our mind, right? So if I think that I'm in here in this room with you all, but then I hear some booming voice that says we need to change the computer program and a few of you disappear or something like that, then I might start to think I'm in a simulation, and I might be puzzled or confused about what's going on. That's a silly example. But whenever we're trying to understand something, this is often the process we go through, right? Initially, we have some beliefs about the way things are. Sometimes those beliefs don't fit together. And then we have to reconcile them by resolving the puzzles. And that's the third step. We look at what other theorists who have dealt with these problems before have said to try to sort things out and understand the answer to the question. So I kind of said this twice now, but that's the overall steps that we're going to go through. And now I'm going to introduce the phenomena, the thing that we're trying to make sense of, that is puzzling. And then we'll talk about some theories that would give an answer to what's going on with this phenomena. And then we'll talk about a theory that puts God, that accounts for how this phenomena us and to the good things that exist in the world. Okay, so here's the phenomena. Sometimes we grasp the value of a thing prior to grasping the descriptive features of things that support that value. What do I mean by that? Sometimes we grasp or understand or perceive the value of a thing prior to grasping the descriptive features of the thing that supports the value. So here's an initial example. Someone told you a funny joke yesterday, and you want to tell your friend about the funny joke. But when you go to try to tell it, you remember how funny it was, right? You remember that it was a great joke, but you cannot remember the content of that joke, right? You can't remember the descriptive features. And then you start to tell the joke and it falls flat, right? You get halfway through maybe, but you can't remember the whole thing, but you can remember really well how funny it was, right? So this is, at least with memory, this is something that happens to us quite often, right? Where I can grasp the value of it, right? It was a really funny joke, but I can't recall what made it funny. That's what bears the value. Does that make sense? So there's the value, and then we assume it's not just funniness, free-floating funniness that isn't explained by anything, right? Something explains the funniness. It was the way the joke was set up, right? And if you can't remember that, then you can't kind of transmit that funniness to somebody else, but you can remember how it was funny. The unusual thing is, though, that it's not just with remembering things that we often experience this. Many times when we enter into an environment, what we sense first is some kind of emotional experience that gives us kind of a sense about what's going on before we can even explain precisely what's going on in terms of describing something that makes us feel a certain way. So the idea is that we get kind of a sense of what matters in a situation before we can explain why. Does that make sense? Here's an example. And this is drawing from a quote from Max Scheler, 20th century philosopher. So he says, "We know of a stage in the grasping of values." Again, that's where we're perceiving something to matter to us, right? Wherein the value of an object is already very clear and evidentially given apart from the givenness of the bearer, right? So just like I was talking about, we have the stage where we feel like something's not right, or we feel like that's beautiful, but we don't know why yet, right? Thus, for example, a man may be distressing. So someone you meet may be distressing or repugnant to you. So it's kind of off-putting, agreeable or sympathetic to us without our being able to indicate how this comes about. In like manner, we can for the longest time consider a poem or another work of art beautiful or ugly, distinguished or common without knowing in the least which properties of the contents of the work prompts this. So what's he saying there? Again, it's this thought that a lot of times we register the value of something before we can really make sense of what it is that accounts for that value. There's a kind of separation between our registration or grasping the goodness of something, the beauty of something, the repugnance of something, and our understanding why, right? Our understanding what makes it repugnant, what makes it beautiful, what makes it good. Those things, what makes it so, we could call what bears the value, what accounts for it. Can anybody else think of an example like this? To maybe kind of check to see if you all are tracking with me on this? Can you think of an example? Yeah, go ahead.
You walk into a situation and it feels threatening, look around the room, you wouldn't know why.
Right.
The hair on your neck stands up.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So the interesting thing about it is it seems that our emotions kind of convey information to us, right? We could say, you have a feeling, right? That something's not right. It's a meaningful feeling. It's telling you something. But it doesn't spell it out for you, right? You have to kind of, if there's something to it, you're going to have to search it out and figure it out. And sometimes there's nothing to it, right? Your feeling was off base. But it can be kind of a guide for discovering what's going on in the situation. It's kind of like a hunch, right? And in other cases, it's like this experience of the beauty of a sunset, right? If someone asks you, you say that's beautiful, tell me exactly why. Spell it out for me. And I might try as hard as I can, but I can't really translate my conviction that it's beautiful, right? In terms of a paragraph about the proportion of the colors, you think those things are involved, but any attempt to kind of break it down to the properties or the features of the situation that you're experiencing may be frustrating, right? It doesn't seem like it does justice to the experience that you've had. Okay. And sometimes it's not just about mundane things, right? The hair kind of raising on your neck, or your sense that someone is really an admirable person, or that someone isn't to be trusted. But also this comes when we have kind of transcendent experiences, right? Of God's presence or of some kind of goodness that doesn't fit within this world, right? That doesn't fit with the things that we understand or grasp. And that's one of the things that C.S. Lewis talked about a lot in his book called Surprised by Joy. The title of the book is really all about this sort of experience. Lewis was not a Christian when he started his college education at Oxford, but he kept being kind of plagued, you might say, by these experiences of what he called joy. They didn't fit his situation. There's something more than what he understood about the world, and it kept moving him to try to make sense of it. Just like when you enter into the room, you're like, something's not right, or something's really good, but I don't know what it is, and you try to figure out what's going on. That's what this experience of joy was for Lewis. And this is kind of a long quote, so I'm going to kind of start a little ways down. As I stood beside a flowering currant bush on a summer day, there suddenly arose in me, without warning, as if from a depth, not of years, but of centuries, the memory of the earlier morning at the old house when my brother had brought his toy garden into the nursery. So he's remembering kind of a childhood memory. It is difficult to find words strong enough for the sensation which came over me. Milton's enormous bliss of Eden comes somewhere near us. It was a sensation, of course, of desire, but desire for what? I'll just stop right there. Isn't that a funny thing to say, that you have an experience where you desire something and you don't even know what it is, right? But when we reflect on human experience, it's not that unusual, right? That's what I'm suggesting. A lot of times we kind of have an emotional sense of the situation we're in, or a sense of a person, or so on, and that precedes our ability to explain it. It's not that it's unrelated, right? These two things relate to each other: our emotional evaluation, appreciation of the situation, and our rational ability to explain what accounts for that. They need to go together somehow. But it's not as if first we kind of analyze things and then we make a judgment about whether it's good or bad. Somehow, we're having access to this information about what matters prior to being able to make sense of everything that's going on, right? And that's what led Lewis to ask questions about his assumptions, right? He assumed that God didn't exist, that we live in a naturalistic universe explained by physics, entirely explained by physics. But he had these experiences of something that was valuable that didn't really fit within what he thought he understood. Now, that didn't give him all the answers, but it set him off to be asking questions about how this important, valuable thing, what makes it valuable, where it's coming from, right? So what I want to propose is that sometimes this translates into kind of transcendent religious experiences, but it's also a kind of everyday part of life that we're kind of emotionally relating to people, our environment, and so on. And that gives us a sense of what matters. And then sometimes the other kind of cognitive parts of us are just trying to catch up to make sense of this sense we have of what's important or what matters. Okay. So what I want to do is kind of break down this experience to kind of to say a few things about what this experience seems to be like. And the branch in philosophy that does this is called phenomenology. So you see it has the word phenomenon in it. We've been talking about that phenomenon, right? We've been talking about an experience. Phenomenology is the study of experience. What it does is it tries to provide language for distinguishing between different types of experiences that we might have. Kind of provides a map so that we can say, okay, there's these kinds of experiences and there's these kind of experiences. We all have kind of a phenomenology that's just like a common sense phenomenology, right? I already used the word emotion, right? And you might distinguish that from making a judgment, right? Or you might distinguish that from reasoning about something. We already have some categories for understanding our experience. We talk about imagination or things like that. So phenomenology is just trying to develop more fine-tuned ways of talking precisely about what our experiences are. And that's what I'm trying to do with this experience, where we emotionally grasp something to be valuable and we can't explain it yet. Okay. So first thing I suggest, and I don't know, can you all in the back see that? Print's a little bit small, but these experiences are object-directed, and they pick out value qualities possessed by things. So what do I mean by object-directed? They're about something, right? When you have this, when Lewis had this sense of joy, he thought it was about something, but he didn't know what it was about, right? But he did receive this information. It's about something, right? Or if you walk into the room and you're like, something's not right in here. You're thinking about something, right? It's about something, that feeling that you have, that suspicion that you have, which is different from some sorts of experiences that we have, right? They may not really be about anything per se. They're not directed to an object of experience. They may just be kind of like a headache, right? Think about a headache. Headache's not really about something. You may think about your headache, right? But the headache is just a state of pain that you're in. It may be caused by something, right? But that's different than when you are thinking about, say, the chair over here, or you're experiencing something and it's telling you about some object out there in the world, right? Not just an internal state of your mind. So it's object-directed, and it seems to be about what matters, right? It seems to be about value qualities, these things that we've been talking about. So when I have a sense that something's not right, that's kind of about a value, about what matters. When I say that something's beautiful, that's about a value. When Lewis talks about that experience of joy, It's something that matters, that's valuable. He says it's something that he desires, but he doesn't know what it is that he desires. And with these specific experiences we've been talking about, at the time, we don't grasp what bears or has the value, right? We can't explain it. It doesn't fit within our scheme. In some cases, we grasp what object or state of affairs has the value, but not the descriptive features in the object that account for the value. What do I mean by that? Sometimes we know it's the sunset that's beautiful, but we don't know how to break it down in order to explain what it is about the sunset that makes it beautiful. But we have an object in mind that we think is the thing that's beautiful, that we feel is that we find beautiful, but we can't explain it in any more detail than that. At other times, like in Lewis's case, we have the sense of something being valuable with his sense of joy, but he doesn't know what the object is at all, right? It's something he wants, and he doesn't even have a name for it, right? So there's cases where you walk into, you meet someone and you're like, there's something not right, right? I'm suspicious of them. Or on the other hand, I really admire them, but I can't tell you exactly what it is about them. There you know what you're thinking about. You're thinking about that person. In other cases, you may have an experience, a kind of an emotional experience, and maybe later on you come to conclude that was God, right? But at the time, maybe you didn't know. It was about something, right? But you don't know what it's about. So these experiences convey value qualities that are given to our mind with intelligibility. What do I mean by intelligibility? It's not like it doesn't make any sense, right? It's not like we can't distinguish between one of these experiences and another one of these experiences, even though we can't explain what it is that is the source of these values that we are experiencing, right? So I can distinguish between my sense of joy, even though I can't explain what the source of the joy is, and my suspicion, right? Those two feelings are very different feelings, right? Suspicion and joy. They're intelligible to me. They're distinct from each other. They mean something and they mean different things from each other. Okay. So it's not like having these emotional experiences are chaotic or confused. They're very clear to us, and we can distinguish between them. They're telling us something, and we have a fairly clear sense about what they're telling us, even though we can't fill in all the gaps. And the intelligibility and object-directedness of these experiences seems to involve feeling, right? So when I remember that the joke is funny, it's the feeling of the funniness of it that I still recall, even though I can't tell you the joke anymore, right? So that part of my memory is still retained, but the content, the punchline, I unfortunately lost, right? And now I can't make other people laugh. Without the feeling, it would seem that there wouldn't be any content, right? So the content that we experience, that sense of joy, that sense of funniness, that sense of suspicion, they all involve a feeling that we're having. It's informational, though. It's an informational feeling. It's telling us something about what matters. But it's distinct from feeling states. These are object-directed feelings. These are feelings that are about things rather than just kind of physical, psychical states, like a headache, right? A headache, like I said, isn't about something. If I have a throbbing pain on my arm, now something caused that pain, but that pain isn't going to tell me what caused it, right? The pain is just there. I just feel the throbbing pain. Whereas a feeling of something being funny is about the joke, right? It's not just like a throbbing positive feeling in my head. No, the funniness is about something. It's object-directed. So we need to distinguish between two different types of feelings. If we're going to say that this is a feeling that we have, it is an object-directed feeling as opposed to a feeling state. A feeling state's like a headache, the throbbing pain that you feel, or maybe just kind of jitteriness if you're anxious. That's one kind of feeling. But it's not the same sort of thing that we're trying to talk about here when we feel that the sunset is beautiful, or we feel that the person is noble or trustworthy or courageous or admirable, or when we feel that, we feel a sense of joy. Those are all about something. They're not just about my state of jitteriness, my state of pain, or my state of pleasure. Okay, so the phenomenology is supposed to give us a more precise understanding of what this experience is that we're trying to make sense of, right? When we have this experience where we're like, I experience joy, I want that, but I don't know what it is. It's object directed, it involves a feeling, and it picks out a value quality, right? It seems to be telling us about something that matters. Okay, so we've gone through the first phase of our method. The first phase was the phenomena, right? The thing that we're trying to make sense of. And now I'm going to introduce two puzzles. Philosophers often, they think their job is to confuse people, right? And it's not just for its own sake, though. Sometimes we have to be confused and puzzled first before we can come to a deeper understanding of something. First, we need to see how our common sense beliefs don't really match up the way that we thought they did. We need to test them and realize, it's harder to make sense of the world than I thought. And so I want to introduce two puzzles. The first one is an epistemological puzzle, and every once in a while in these slides I throw in a big word, but I always make sure to explain it. What do I mean by epistemological? Having to do with thinking or knowing. Episteme is the Greek word for knowledge, right? So this is a puzzle about how our minds interact with the world, right? And come to grasp things. The second puzzle I'm going to introduce is an ontological puzzle, and that's a puzzle about how things exist. Those are two of the main things that we do in philosophy. In philosophy, we're asking questions about what we know, how we can know it. That's kind of approaching from our side of things, trying to make sense of the world. And then there's what exists, right? So when we have a complete philosophy, we have to do both. And we usually have to do both in tandem, right? We're trying to make sense of what exists, how it exists, what it's like. And in the process of doing that, we have to give an account of how we determine those things, how we come to grasp those things. Okay, so the epistemological puzzle, starting with that phenomena that we were just talking about. How is it that we could grasp the value of an object independently of the descriptive features of that object? Right? That's just starting with that initial experience that we have. How is that possible? That we have a sense of how much something matters without even knowing what it is that matters. That seems weird. Do you agree? It seems like normally, there's quite a bit of text here, it seems like normally the way it should work is that first we understand the descriptive features of something and then we evaluate it, right? First we get a lay of the land, first we understand, okay, there's this podium here, and then I make a judgment about whether this is a good podium or a bad podium, right? But first I need to understand what it is I'm evaluating. Whether it has a value or not is something that comes second, after I understand what it is that I'm evaluating. But what's going on in these experiences, it seems like the evaluation comes first. This is something great, but I don't know what it is. That sounds kind of silly, right? Except that we have this kind of common experience where the evaluation precedes the description of what it is that we're evaluating. That's puzzling, right? Because normally we would think that you have to understand first what you're evaluating as good or bad, beautiful or ugly, before you can make the evaluation. So how is it that our minds can kind of get ahead of ourselves like that? So, but we've just discussed instances that don't seem to fit this normal program for determining whether something is good or bad, where we kind of have an emotional experience that tells us to be able to make a judgment. So it seems that we're not, how is this possible? My feeling, the beautiful, is really about the sunset. It's not just about me, right? When I feel that someone is admirable, it's really object directed, like we described with our phenomenology. Then how is it that we do that without knowing what is the basis for that sense or value first, right? So this is an epistemological question because it's a question about how we could possibly come to know those things or be, and that really be something we know about the thing when we don't have a basis yet for knowing those things. Do you see what the puzzle is there? Does that make sense? So when it comes to this sort of experience, it seems like we're ahead of ourselves, right? And it seems like we don't really have a basis for saying sunset is beautiful until we can break it down, right? In terms of our reasons. But we act on these kind of emotional hunches, right? They guide our decision making sometimes, right? Not a good deal. Can't tell you exactly why, but I'm not entering into it because I think that something's not right here, right? So we let these emotional appraisals of our situation kind of guide our decision making on a fairly regular basis. Are we irrational for doing that or not? Right? That's the epistemological question. If it's not irrational, how is our mind working that it's actually telling us about things before we can kind of explain the reason be making those value judgments? Okay, here's the second puzzle, the ontological puzzle, and this is the puzzle about what exists. We tend to assume that the value of something, and I'm going to talk about two examples here, the value of an action or an artwork depends for its existence on the descriptive features of the work. Right? We tend to think that. We tend to think that if the Mona Lisa is beautiful because of the way that Leonardo da Vinci painted it. Right? It's not just beautiful for no reason. On the other hand, there's a kind of independence of the value from the features. So, I can modify the Mona Lisa a little bit. And it doesn't mean that the value goes away. Historic paintings that no one really realized it for centuries, but parts of the painting got cropped off, right? Because they needed to fit it into a new space. So there's some Rembrandts where they cropped off the top a little bit, cropped off the side. So the painting is not the same painting. But you might say, despite these changes in descriptive features, the value of it stays the same, right? So while the value of the painting depends upon the descriptive features, there's a kind of quasi-independence from them. And the same might be said for an action, right? An act may remain noble or cowardly when some of the features of the act, exactly the way we went about things, change, right? So it doesn't seem to be explained purely in terms of exactly what we did. It has to do with the overall way that we did something that makes it cowardly or noble or something like that. And another way to look at it, more than one act may bear the same value and be radically different in its descriptive features. And the same could be said for an artwork, right? You could have a painting that's graceful, and you could have a dance that's graceful. What do those two things have in common, right? Descriptively, they're very different from each other, right? You'd have a sunset that's beautiful and the Mona Lisa that's beautiful. The value, you might say, I'm talking about the same value in some broad sense, but the two things descriptively are radically different from each other. So while we assume that these values depend upon the features that the thing has, there's a kind of independence at the same time from those features. And that's kind of perplexing, right? So there's a dependence, but also a kind of independence. And that, however things are made sense of, that kind of fits with our experience too, that we were just talking about at the beginning, right? This experience where we can have a sense of the value of a thing before we understand the descriptive features that make sense of it, right? That's what Shaler said at the beginning. He said, for a long time, you can have a conviction that the poem was beautiful or the artwork was beautiful. And maybe for your whole life, you could never tell a person what it is that made it beautiful, right? But that doesn't really sway or change your belief that it really is beautiful. So you're getting that information somehow, but it's not mediated through or exactly dependent on the features of the situation, a careful analysis of those. Even though, here's the paradoxical part, you wouldn't have a beautiful Mona Lisa without some paint on a canvas, right? There's the details of the painting that make it beautiful. It's not like it's just beautiful no matter what happens to the details, right? If I put a mustache on the Mona Lisa, which famous French philosopher Duchamp, he took a copy of the Mona Lisa and he did that. It changes the overall aesthetic, right? It changes the value of it. You make some modifications and it's going to have a different feel to it, right? There's definitely a relationship there between the value of something and the details. Okay. So this fact that there's kind of a relative independence, where there's no perfect match between what exactly makes an action courageous, where you have different instances of courage, and where you can modify the action a little bit and they all count as courageous, or you can have radically different things that you call courageous. This independence, this relative independence of values, and the fact that we seem to be able to kind of appraise things emotionally as, say, courageous or valuable and so on without knowing why, raises some doubts about whether the values are really real or they're just in my mind, right? Are they really real out there in the sunset, or is this in the end an expression of how something else makes me feel, right? A feeling state that I have. Remember the difference? I talked about object-directed feelings and feeling states. Maybe there aren't really object-directed feelings. Maybe they're all just feeling states where I start to feel positive, and then I interpret that to mean something, right? So maybe my initial description of what's going on, we have a sense of, something's not right in here. Really, maybe that's all just about you, what's going on in your head. And it's not really telling you directly something about what's going on out there in the world. Maybe there aren't values out there in the world. It's just how you value and appreciate things, and you're kind of projecting yourself onto things, right? So one person looks at the sunset and says it's beautiful because they're having a good day and they feel good. The other person's like, it's depressing, right? It's ugly because that's how they're feeling. So maybe this separation between value and the descriptive features of the world, maybe that supports the idea that goodness isn't something that's really in the world, it's something that's really kind of in our heads. So some would argue that rather than being intrinsic in the action or in the artwork, these values simply reflect how a person subjectively feels about the artwork or the action. So it's really about what's going on in our head, even though we kind of think that it's about something out there in the world. We're fooling ourselves, maybe. So 2 puzzles, epistemological puzzle. How is it that we emotionally seem to be able to grasp what matters in a situation without understanding the details of the situation? Second, what is the relationship between the value of something and the underlying descriptive features that we tend to assume account for the value that it has? And these doubts or puzzles, some would argue, support a subjectivist view of value, right? Where the things aren't intrinsically valuable. It's really just about my subjective impression about those things, how the feeling states that it generates in my mind, and then I interpret those to be about you, to be about the sunset, to be about the Mona Lisa. But it's really about me. Okay. Now, if you remember what we talked about with those stages, that methodology, we're now on to stage 3, right? So the first stage was starting with the way things appear. And the appearance that we're trying to make sense of is this sense that this ability that human beings have to kind of have an emotional sense of a situation before they can rationally make sense of it, right? So when you find someone to be repugnant or someone to be admirable, but you can't say exactly why, or you find a poem to be beautiful, but you can't spell it out. We talked about how that experience is object-directed, it involves a feeling, and it's picking up on value qualities, right? Then the second stage of our methodology was, which is our method for coming to understand and know things, was we found that there are some inconsistencies that raise some doubts or raise some puzzles for us that we need to provide a theory to try to make sense of and understand, to explain. And the two puzzles were epistemological puzzle and an ontological puzzle, a puzzle about how we come to know things, how our minds interact with the world, and an ontological puzzle. And the epistemological puzzle was usually we think that if we're making an evaluation of something, first we have to understand what that something is, and then we apply standards to it, and then we evaluate it. But with this phenomena that we've been talking about, it seems like first we make an evaluation emotionally. Think about C.S. Lewis's sense of joy, and we don't know what the basis for it is yet. So that doesn't seem to fit with maybe how we commonsensically or standardly think about how evaluation works, if the evaluation is really about the thing and not something about us. And then the second puzzle was the ontological one, where we, on the one hand, we have these common sense beliefs that you don't have a beautiful painting without paint, right? You don't have a courageous action without something specific that someone does. On the other hand, the value seems to be kind of semi-independent from the specific features of the situation. You can modify the painting a little bit. You can have multiple artworks that are vastly different from one another descriptively, but we say they have the same kind of grace or beauty. So what exactly is the relationship between the value and the descriptive features of the thing? And that led to these doubts. Maybe the reason we are able to kind of emotionally get ahead of ourselves, maybe the reason there's a disconnect a little bit between the descriptive features of the thing and our evaluation of it is because the values are all in our head, right? The goodness is just a matter of how I'm feeling, and then I'm projecting that out on the world, and we call that view subjectivism, okay? So what I want to do here, the next step, now that we talked about a phenomena, we've talked about some puzzles about that phenomena, is to talk about some different theories for sorting out these puzzles, right? And I have Aristotle's Greek word for these theories or opinions. These are called endoxa. These are like the prevailing ways of making sense of the world. Doxa, the word doxa and the word doctrine, they're related, right? The word doctrine comes from this Greek word and then some Latin derivative, which I don't know. But the idea is doctrine is an account of the way things are, right? And that doesn't just apply to theological questions, but any kind of questions. We have kind of general ways of understanding the way things are. These aren't just our common sense beliefs, but these are things that people have asked these questions before us. They've kind of developed different answers for understanding them. So I want us to provide us with a little bit of a roadmap for understanding how we might answer the epistemological question, the question about how our minds link up to values in the world, if they are in the world, and Also some ontological theories about the relationship between value and other features of the world. So starting with the epistemological views, we have two broad categories, cognitivism and non-cognitivism about value. And we've been kind of throwing around some different options already, so I just want to recognize what those are. The first type of cognitivism would be kind of a judgment theory. So when you find something to be valuable, what you're doing with your mind is you're making a judgment about that thing that it has that value, right? So you're evaluating it, right? So think about, say, an art critic. They take a look at the, I don't know, does anyone here use Rotten Tomatoes to decide whether they're going to watch a movie? Kind of aggregates different reviews that other movie reviewers have used to help you give a sense, is this worth my time? And if it gets a Rotten Tomato, then maybe it's not worth your time, right? Or if it's a fresh tomato, then a lot of people have evaluated. Well, what did they do? They watch the film, they apply some standards that they have, and maybe they're not all the same, right? Maybe you have very different standards from the movie reviewer, so you evaluate it differently. So this form of cognitivism would say, when we are valuing something, even if it is emotionally, what's really going on is a judgment. We're making a judgment. We're taking that information in, applying some kind of standard, and judging whether it's good or bad, noble, courageous, cowardly, beautiful, and so on. Now, the tricky thing about that view, as it relates to that experience that we were talking about at the beginning of class, is, for one thing, it seems like we don't have the information we need to be making an evaluation, right? I don't know why it is that I think that that the person is admirable. I feel that they are, right? That doesn't seem the same as these judgments that we make where we get the content, the information first, and we apply our standard, and then we make a judgment, right? That seems to involve a lot more kind of thought processes than what's going on with the experience that we're trying to make sense of that I introduced at the beginning of our time. So there's another form of cognitivism, and this would say that these experiences that we have are better understood as perceptual. It's not that I don't register that this, including that the podium is black, right? It's just given to me or appears to me that way, right? That's the information I start with. And then I can make judgments about it, but it's my initial input of information. So value perceptualism, or valueception, if you will, holds the view that values aren't kind of something that come, our registration of values out there in the world don't come second. They kind of come on their own terms, right? So we have this kind of emotion, we have an emotional response, and it is a perception of something being valuable. It's not a judgment. It's not that we take in the information, apply the standard, and then make the judgment. It's just that it's appearing to us to matter, right? It's appearing to us to be valuable. Now, I think that view fits better. Now, it might have other problems with it, but that view, I think, fits better with that initial experience that we're trying to make sense of, right? That phenomena where you just register something to be valuable, beautiful, or so on, or good, but you can't say why. That seems more perceptual in nature than like a judgment, I think. So if we're looking for a theory that just matches onto that experience, then a perception-based kind of view of cognitivism seems like a better fit. And then there's non-cognitivism. And this is those theory, that kind of idea that I was talking about just a little bit earlier, where we conclude that really the values are all in your head, there's no values out there in the world that you're detecting, either perceptually or on the basis of a judgment, you're really just projecting yourself. Do you know what I mean when I say you're projecting? Like, you can think of some people, they have really strong feelings about certain things, and they kind of project those opinions onto you, right? There's such strong sports fans for the Seahawks that they assume that you are a Seahawks fan as well. They're projecting, right? Their love for the Seahawks just kind of covers everything else, and they can't see clearly, right? Well, this non-cognitivism, in a sense, would say, we think we're picking up on what matters, and it's really about the things out there in the world, that person is actually courageous and we should admire them. But it's really telling us something about how we feel, right? And someone else might feel very differently, right? Someone might find the same person repugnant or cowardly. Okay, so those are kind of some options for understanding how our minds relate to the world, and we've given them some names and some labels so that we can go back to them fairly quickly and easily and talk about these different options. Now to ontological views that might kind of make sense of the relationship between value qualities that things have, and the descriptive features. And by the descriptive features, I mean features that maybe a scientist would pick up on in a laboratory, right? That could break it down and analyze something in terms of the basically non-value features that a thing has. So a scientist can come in and analyze the geometry of the Mona Lisa and the color patterns of the Mona Lisa and the paint that's used in the Mona Lisa. But the scientist, with all of that study, won't pick up on the value of the Mona Lisa, right? This seems to be wholly different sort of quality. So the puzzle we were dealing with is, what's the relationship between these values and the descriptive features? So one family of theories would be value realism. The values are really out there in the world. The Mona Lisa, it's not just that I'm projecting on the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa really is beautiful in its own distinctive sort of way, right? But beautiful in some way that's comparable to other objects that we call beautiful. And that action was really courageous. Even though it's so different from some other sort of courageous action, they both have the same sort of value. Okay, and within value realism, I probably at this point you're wondering, where does our discussion about God's relation to the good? We're getting there. We're almost there. Okay. So under value realism, if you think that values are objective, right, that there really are some things that are good and there really are some things that are bad, there's a couple different approaches or theories. There's naturalism, which holds that values are real in some sense, but they're really, in the end, reducible to the descriptive features that the scientists could test and study. Maybe the words that we use, like beautiful, maybe it's really hard to ever translate that in terms of to purely descriptive features that the scientists can test, but it's possible. And in the end, that's all that exists, are descriptive features. So we call this type of realism naturalism. So it holds there really are values, but they are ultimately reduced down to descriptive features of the world. So you might think, that's kind of confusing. Why would you say the values are really real if they're reducible? Well, the idea is that there's some kind of consistent, principled law that we could discover, some pattern of descriptive features for identifying something as courageous, right? And you might give a shot at it, right? What does courage involve? There's some kind of risk, right? There's some kind of risk, some kind of threat to your well-being. And nevertheless, you act on behalf of something else that's good. So we've broken it down a little bit, right? you're able to withstand some threat and act courageously in the face of it without being overcome by your fear. At that point, that definition of courage hasn't gotten rid of all the value language, right? I talked about risk. I talked about your well-being and those sorts of things. The naturalist would want to go the next step and say, okay, and now with well-being, we can reduce that down to understanding what that is in terms of maybe your desires or your instincts or so on, and fulfilling those. So the naturalist project is to take all of our value language and in a systematic sort of way, explain it in terms of the sorts of things that scientists study, right? Behavior, in terms of human behavior and in terms of physical descriptions. Okay. And then the alternative is some form of non-naturalism. Values are not reducible to the descriptive features of an object. Instead, in some sense, values have some kind of independence, though maybe still they are related to the descriptive features of an object. And then at the other extreme, kind of fitting with the non-cognitivism on the epistemological side, is value anti-realism. There are no objective values, right? And you could see how that pairs well with the epistemological view of non-cognitivism, right? These kind of pair up with each other. If you're trying to develop a consistent view about the way the world is and how we come to know it, you're going to have to take a view about what exists and how we come to know it. Well, the non-cognitivist about values says values are associative feelings or preferences that a subject has, but they're not really about things in the world. That pairs up very nicely with value anti-realism, right? Why? Because there are no objective values. There are no values that the things actually have that we're trying to discover and detect by whatever way we do that. Instead, it's about the feeling states that we may happen to have. Okay. So if we're taking that experience that I was talking about at the beginning of our session, if we're taking it kind of at face value, I think that at face value, it seems that we think that we're picking up on real qualities in our environment, right? Lewis didn't think that he was just having some kind of high when he experienced joy, and he didn't think there was anything more to it, some kind of physical high like he was on drugs or something like that. When he experienced joy, he thought it was about something, right? It was about something beyond him, right? So if we're taking the experience as it's given to us, it seems to fit with some kind of realism about value and some kind of cognitivism, okay? That somehow our minds are grasping this thing that matters, and that it's really something beyond me that may have a claim on me, right? Because that's wrong, because that's harming someone, because that's bad, I'm not going to do it. It's not just a matter of my state of mind, but it's about something that's going on in the actual world. But sometimes we have to abandon how things initially seem to us, because theoretically it just generates all sorts of contradictions, and we have those puzzles that we're trying to explain. How is it that we can kind of have an emotional appraisal of our situation without knowing what it is that we're appraising? And how is it that values can relate to the descriptive features of an object when the descriptive features change but the values don't change, or vice versa? Okay. So I'm going to say a little bit about some of these options, but what I'm working toward is a version of non-naturalism where these values really are out there in the world, and they're not wholly reducible to descriptive features of the world. They're not wholly reducible to the sorts of characteristics that a natural or social scientist could study and kind of analyze, but they're really real. And they are detected, at least at one stage, perceptually, through a kind of emotional contact with the world, right? Where we have that sense of joy, we have some kind of feeling of something being beautiful. that's giving us information out about something out there in the world. Okay. And the version of value anti-realism that I've referenced before is this idea of subjectivism. Values are imputed to objects by a person rather than possessed by the object. Okay. But I'm kind of working towards an account of non-naturalistic value perception. Okay. So we're going to talk about some types of non-naturalism, and then we're still working towards seeing how could good things point to God, right? How could value be kind of a pointer to God? Maybe that's the most coherent way of understanding real value in the world and our ability to grasp that value. Okay. So on the one hand, there's theistic non-naturalism. Objects have value qualities, to some extent independently of their descriptive features, and these values depend for their existence on God. Okay? So how is it that things have these values? Is because somehow they're related to God in a way that gives them that value. Right? And I'm going to show my cards a little bit. What's one sort of relationship that something like a sunset could have that could be like a relationship it has to God that gives it its value being beautiful? If it's in some way an image or reflection of God's goodness or God's beauty or perfection, that in some sense we're getting a glimpse of the glory of God. So we understand the objective value that the thing has in relation to God. That's how ultimately we account for it. So there are theistic accounts of how there are real values in the world. And those theories trace back to God as the source of the values that the things have. And then there are non-theistic, non-naturalist accounts. So there are attempts to say there really are these things that are not reducible to physical descriptions, and we call these things values. They are not reducible, but they don't come from God. They're not based on a relationship that those things have to God. Okay. So objects have value qualities independently of their descriptive features, and these values do not depend for their existence on God. So these are two types of non-naturalism. I'm going to give you an example of a non-theistic non-naturalism, and then I'm going to wrap up by talking about theistic non-naturalism, which is the position that I prefer, that I think makes the most sense of that phenomena that we were talking about originally. Okay. So this is a fairly unusual view, right? Most people who don't believe in God aren't also not non-naturalists in philosophy. They tend to either be anti-realists, where they'd say the values are just your subjective projections. They're not things that are out that the world qualities that things in the world actually have, or they are value realists, but they're naturalists about value. Remember naturalism? So naturalism is the view that, yes, things have values, but they are in the end ultimately reducible to the world as described by physics. Ultimately, it all boils down to atoms spinning in fields of force. It'd be a really long description to explain how the beauty of the Mona Lisa can get translated into contemporary physics, but it's in theory possible, according to the naturalist, right? Ultimately, everything boils down to these physical features. And when we say that something is beautiful, that's just kind of a very high level way of talking about something that breaks down in terms of these very few features that everything in the world has. So the non-naturalist has rejected that idea. Values are something that they are what they are in their own right. They can't be fully reduced to non-value descriptions. And so there are some who are convinced of this, but they don't believe that God exists. And so they try to carve out some kind of middle territory where there really are values in the world, but they don't come from God. They kind of come from the universe. And the universe has some kind of direction or value that it's working towards, but it doesn't come from God. That's the idea. So I'm going to read this quote from Thomas Nagel, who articulates this sort of perspective. So he says, we recognize, so this is his account about how things have value, but it's not coming from a divine source. So he says we recognize that evolution has given rise to multiple organisms that have a good. So he believes that in a robust sense, where there really is something that's good for the tortoise, or there's something that's actually good, objectively good for a human being. And it's kind of written into the nature of reality, so that things can go well or badly for them. And that in some of these organisms, there has appeared the additional capacity to aim consciously at their own good, and ultimately at what is good in itself. From a realist perspective, this cannot be merely an accidental side effect of natural selection, and a teleological explanation satisfies this condition. The teleological hypothesis is that these things may be determined not merely by value-free chemistry and physics, but also by something else, namely a cosmic predisposition to the formation of life, consciousness, and the value that is inseparable from them. So what is Nagel saying? Nagel doesn't think that in purely naturalistic terms, in terms of kind of blind causation and blind evolution, that we could account for value in the world. So where does it come from? Why is it that things matter? He suggests somehow the universe is predisposed towards these things. It's just kind of inbuilt. It's a brute fact about the universe that it's tending in this direction. But that's the end of the explanation, end of the story, right? No more questions, right? That doesn't come from somewhere else. It is just the way things are, that the universe wants to tend towards the formation of life, consciousness, and the value that is inseparable from them. So he's saying those things really matter, and somehow that they're encoded into the nature of reality, and reality kind of tends in that direction, right? So the universe could have evolved in many different ways, Nagel would say, but it evolved that way because not simply a matter of blind chance, but because the universe wants to go that way. Okay. So that's a version of non-theistic non-naturalism that's trying to explain how there really are these values, they robustly exist, and how they're related to the descriptive features of the world, right? There is a connection between the way you might describe some organism and what's good for that organism. And where that comes from, where that connection comes from, it just comes from the universe having this predisposition or tendency. Now, I think the advantage of a theistic account is it can provide some kind of ultimate ground or explanation beyond just kind of stipulating that way, really say why, beyond that, right? So on a theistic account, the reason, if God's made the universe to be a certain way, if God's made us, if we are a certain way, and there's a connection between us and having a certain dignity or value that our minds are able to detect, it's because there's a source, right? It's not simply a matter of, it's just the way the universe happens to be. There's a source that really explains the value structures that we find in the world and our capacity to tune into them and detect them. That's the theistic picture. So why is it that we have this ability to be detecting or perceiving what matters in the world? It's because we are made in the image of God, and God is kind of is goodness itself. God is goodness itself and wants us to know him, right? And so it's not surprising, right, that we have this ability that, just like for Lewis, keys us in to what matters. It's almost like sending us a message ahead of time, right? Our minds are programmed to be able to receive those messages, right? To be able to lead us closer to the truth before we even know what the truth is, right? That was the kind of paradoxical thing about those experiences we were talking about, where you have this sense of something being important, but you don't know what it is yet. Well, from a theistic standpoint, it makes sense, not just in terms of like its instinctual value or something like that. It makes sense that our minds are programmed this way to be able to detect what matters before we can fully make sense of it, because it's designed to lead us back to the source of those values, to lead us back to God. So according to theistic non-naturalism, the values of objects constitute what they are, and what they are is determined by God. So what I'm suggesting here is I'm trying to answer that ontological question. What's the relationship between the descriptive features of things and the value that that thing has? We are made the way that we are in order to realize certain values, right? There's a certain value or goodness that comes with being human. There's also a certain value or goodness that comes with what a tree is, right? These are linked to each other. And what is that value? In different ways, we image or reflect who God is, right? We're all like little kind of vantage points on God's goodness, right? We're all stick figures of the one true figure, right? And we get glimpses of God's goodness in the goodness of the created things that God has made. It's not that we use analogies like with an artist, right? We see the mind of the artist kind of reflected in the things that the artist has made. Oops. Now, you might kind of find this funny, but I'm going back prior to, this quotation here takes us back prior to Christianity, and traces back some of the philosophical roots of this idea, though I think you could also trace them out in Genesis, right, where it says that we were made in the image of God. There's also a Greek philosophical tradition that when Christianity came onto the scene, they said, hey, I see some connection points there. We could use that to develop a further framework for understanding God's relation to the world. So this comes from Plato's Phaedrus. He said, this is talking about when people have that experience that kind of leads them to question, want to know the way the world is more. It says, only a few remain whose memory is good enough, and they are startled when they see an image of what they saw up there. Then they are beside themselves, and their experience is beyond their comprehension. So he's talking about that experience that we talked about at the beginning of the session, where sometimes we have a sense of the value of something before we can make sense of it. And what Plato thinks is that's really important for our quest as a human being, to try to understand what goodness is, where we fit into the world. That's often triggered initially by these transcendent experiences we have of goodness. So according to this version of theistic non-naturalism, the things that exist, what's the relationship between the descriptive features and the value that they have? They're goods. The things that exist are organized in a way to realize some kind of reflection of God's perfect goodness. Everything that exists is a finite reflection of the goodness of God. And as goods, their descriptive features are organized around their value structure. So you have a wheelbarrow. It's got a certain structure to it, right? It's got kind of a space where you can put stuff. It's got a wheel. And we can make a judgment about whether it's a good wheelbarrow or not, because all the features it have are organized to realize some kind of value, right? Get stuff around, right? We can realize when the wheelbarrow doesn't exist anymore, right? Because it is no longer able to do what wheelbarrows do for us. Well, this view says, actually, everything is like that. not because everything's a tool, but everything is a reflection of God and of God's goodness in its own created finite way to kind of echo God's perfect goodness. And each of us do that in distinctive ways from one another. Each created thing does that in a distinctive way from one another, but that explains the connection between value, the value we perceive in things, and the qualities or characteristics that it has. And so those objects image or reflect the goodness of an infinite God. So what's the relationship between God and the created things? God is the source of those things' goodness. They are reflections of God's goodness. That's the idea. Okay, so we started with this experience that is actually kind of a common experience, even though we don't think about it that often, where we have an emotional sense of what's valuable or matters, but we don't know why. And then we talked about some puzzles associated with that. Does that mean that values are just in our head? Does that mean that that values aren't real? And we talked about some different options for understanding that experience. And then I closed by talking about a theory that it would account for that experience that we have that fits within a theistic framework, where God's goodness and intentions for the created world account for that ability that we have to pick up on what matters. And that ability that we have isn't based on nothing, right? It actually is a reliable guide to kind of navigating our world, though it can certainly foul up, right? Sometimes we can think something is good when it's not. But God's hardwired our minds to be open to and detecting those values. And what those values are ultimately are a kind of echo or reflection of God's perfect goodness. And that sometimes leads us to have an experience like Lewis was talking about, right? Where it's just a little thing, right? He's in a garden. But there's something about that the goodness of that experience transcended it, and he realized how it was a reflection for a moment of the source of that goodness, the source of the beauty of the garden, and it gave him this great joy because his mind was he was having contact with God's goodness through the things that are a reflection of it. All right, thanks so much. That was a pretty long talk. You were good sports. We went through a number of different technical terms, and I think that we have a few more minutes if you have some questions. Yeah.
I'm sensing parallel with Lewis's abolition of man to some of this.
Yeah.
I see a lot of what he was getting at in this way of perceiving the world.
That's absolutely right.
Danger in it.
Right. So Lewis said he thought there was a problem. He talks about this problem of men without chess, right? He thought that there's something important about our emotional life that helps us to detect and pick up on what matters. And if we just try to approach the world in a certain kind of rationalistic way that ignores that way of knowing things, that we're going to not be able to talk correctly and to make good, accurate judgments about what matters. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Thank you so much for your time. It was I really appreciate it.
Dr. Potter, thank you so much. It's such an